Edinburgh Castle, the Headless Drummer and Prisoner's Spirits. Chapter 1. The Drummer's Warning. The autumn of 1650 descended upon Edinburgh like a shroud, bringing with it winds that howled through the narrow closes and vennels of the old town. Perched atop its volcanic throne of black basalt, Edinburgh Castle stood as it had for centuries, a sentinel of stone gazing out across the Firth of Forth. Within its ancient walls, life continued as it always had. Guards patrolled the battlements, servants tended to their duties, and the garrison went about their daily routines. Yet on that particular October evening, as darkness crept across Castle Rock, something changed. Margaret Sinclair had served in the castle kitchens for nearly 15 years. She was a practical woman, not given to flights of fancy or nervous disposition. Her hands were calloused from years of scrubbing pots and kneading bread, her back bent slightly from carrying heavy loads up the steep castle inclines. As she made her way across the central courtyard that evening, her arms laden with linens for the officers' quarters, she heard it first, a sound that made her pause mid-step. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. It was the steady, rhythmic beating of a drum, echoing off the stone walls that enclosed the courtyard. Margaret frowned, adjusting her grip on the linens. The garrison had completed their evening drill hours ago, and there was no reason for any drummer to be practicing at this hour. The sound continued, unchanging in its tempo, circling the courtyard with mechanical precision. Setting down her burden near the well, Margaret peered into the gathering gloom. The courtyard was lit only by a few flickering torches mounted on the walls, their flames dancing in the October wind. In the wavering light, she could make out a figure, small, slight of build, marching in a perfect circle around the courtyard's perimeter. The figure wore what appeared to be a drummer's uniform, though the details were difficult to discern in the dim light. A large drum hung before him, and his arms moved with practiced rhythm, beating out that same steady pattern. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. "You there?" Margaret called out, her voice sharp with the authority of one who had managed difficult servants for years. "What are you doing out here at this hour? The captain'll have your hide if he catches you disturbing the peace." The figure did not respond. It simply continued its circular march, the drum beating endlessly. Margaret felt the first stirring of unease in her belly. She took a step closer, squinting against the darkness. There was something wrong about the way the figure moved, too stiff, too mechanical, as if it were a clockwork toy rather than a living boy. "I'm speaking to you, lad," she called again, louder this time. Still no response. The drummer marched on, passing within 20 feet of where she stood. As the figure crossed through a patch of torchlight, Margaret gasped and stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. The scream that rose in her throat emerged as barely a whisper. The drummer had no head. Where his neck should have risen to meet skull and face, there was nothing. His uniform collar ended in empty air, yet still his arms moved, still the drum beat its relentless rhythm. The headless figure continued its circuit, marching with the precision of a trained soldier, round and round the courtyard. Margaret's legs gave way beneath her, and she crumpled to the cobblestones. The linens she had been carrying scattered around her, white against the gray stone. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps as she watched the impossible figure complete its circuit once, twice, 3 times. The sound of the drum seemed to grow louder with each rotation, filling her ears until she thought she might go mad from it. It was William Murray, one of the castle guards, who found her there some minutes later. He had heard the drum from his post on the battlements and had come to investigate, expecting to find some foolish young soldier disobeying orders. Instead, he found Margaret Sinclair, a woman he had always known to be stalwart and unshakable, sitting on the ground with tears streaming down her face, pointing at the empty courtyard. "It's still there," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Can you not see it? Can you not hear?" William strained his eyes into the darkness, but he saw nothing save the empty courtyard. Yet as he stood there, his hand resting on Margaret's shoulder, he became aware of a sound, faint, distant, but unmistakable. The beating of a drum echoing off the ancient stones. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. The phenomenon did not end that night. Over the following weeks, more servants and guards reported seeing the headless drummer, always at dusk, always in the central courtyard, always marching in that same relentless circle. Some saw the figure clearly, as Margaret had. Others only heard the drum, that steady beat that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. A few brave souls attempted to approach the drummer, to reach out and touch what seemed to be only an apparition. Those who did reported feeling nothing but cold air where solid flesh should have been, and all spoke of an overwhelming sense of dread that rose in them the closer they drew to the phantom drummer. Captain James Rutherford, commander of the castle garrison, was a military man through and through. He had served under the Marquis of Argyll during the Wars of the Three Kingdoms and had seen enough death and destruction to last several lifetimes. He did not believe in ghosts, spirits, or any such nonsense. When his men first brought him reports of the drummer, he dismissed them as the product of too much ale and too little sleep. But when his own wife, Elizabeth, saw the drummer with her own eyes and came to him white-faced and trembling, he could no longer ignore what was happening. Elizabeth was the daughter of a minister, a God-fearing woman who would never speak falsely. If she said she had seen a headless drummer marching through the courtyard, then James Rutherford had no choice but to believe her. "What does it mean, James?" Elizabeth asked that evening as they sat before their fire. "What kind of unnatural thing haunts our home?" James shook his head slowly, staring into the flames. In his years of military service, he had learned to read omens. He had seen the ravens gathering before Marston Moor, had watched the unseasonable fog roll in before the disaster at Preston. Soldiers were superstitious by nature, and they learned to pay attention to signs that others might dismiss. "I fear it means war is coming," he said finally. "My grandfather used to tell stories of phantom armies seen before great battles, of harbingers that appeared to warn of coming bloodshed." "But war with whom?" Elizabeth pressed. "The king is in exile. Cromwell has crushed all opposition in England, surely." "Cromwell?" James interrupted, his voice grim. "Oliver Cromwell has turned his eyes to Scotland. The Parliament has named him Lord General. They say his new model army has never tasted defeat." Elizabeth's hand found her husband's, gripping it tightly. "Then the drummer is a warning." "Aye," James agreed, "a warning that we have not heeded." He was right to be concerned. In the weeks following the first appearance of the headless drummer, reports began filtering into the castle of Cromwell's movements. The English general had indeed invaded Scotland, and his army was marching north with terrible purpose. The Scottish Parliament scrambled to organize resistance, but they were divided and weakened by internal conflicts. The young King Charles II, son of the executed Charles I, had been crowned at Scone, but his support was far from universal. The drummer continued to appear each evening, his silent march a nightly reminder of the approaching doom. The servants grew accustomed to his presence, though they never lost their fear of him. Some began to leave offerings in the courtyard, pieces of bread, cups of ale, though the phantom never acknowledged these gifts. The steady beat of his drum became as much a part of the castle's soundscape as the call of the watch or the clatter of hooves on cobblestones. Young Thomas Gray, a groom who worked in the castle stables, became fascinated by the drummer. While others avoided the courtyard at dusk, Thomas would position himself to watch the nightly appearance. He sketched what he saw in a small journal he kept hidden in his quarters, trying to capture the eerie quality of the headless figure with charcoal and paper. "Why do you think he has no head?" Thomas asked William Murray one evening as they both watched the phantom circuit. William, who had grown philosophical about the haunting, shrugged. "Perhaps he lost it in battle. Perhaps that's how he died." "But why does he warn us? Why would a spirit care what happens to us living folk?" "Maybe he doesn't," William replied. "Maybe he's just doing what he did in life, beating his drum to signal danger. Death hasn't changed his duty." As November arrived, bringing with it bitter cold and the first hints of winter, Cromwell's army drew nearer. They had defeated the Scottish forces at Dunbar, a catastrophic battle that left thousands of Scots dead or captured. Edinburgh itself lay open to the English army, its defenses minimal. Captain Rutherford knew that the castle would be besieged. It was only a matter of time. The night before Cromwell's forces reached Edinburgh, the drummer appeared earlier than usual, while the sun still hung low in the western sky. For the first time, more than a dozen people witnessed his march simultaneously. The beating of his drum seemed louder than ever before, echoing off the castle walls with an urgency that made hearts race and palms sweat. Margaret Sinclair stood watching from the doorway of the kitchens. In the weeks since her first encounter with the drummer, she had found a strange sort of peace with his presence. She no longer feared him. Instead, she felt a deep sadness when she saw him. He had been a boy once, she thought, someone's son. Now he was bound to this place, condemned to march eternally with a warning that would never be heeded in time. "Thank you for trying," she whispered into the evening air. "We saw your warning, we just couldn't stop what's coming." That night, the drummer marched until dawn. His rat-a-tat-tat continued unbroken through the dark hours, growing fainter as morning approached, but never quite fading away entirely. When the sun rose on December 24, 1650, Cromwell's army was at the gates of Edinburgh. The siege that followed would become known as the Lang Siege. Cromwell's forces surrounded Castle Rock, cutting off all supplies and access. Inside the walls, Captain Rutherford and his garrison prepared for a long defense. They had provisions to last several months, and the castle's position on its rocky height made it nearly impregnable to direct assault. But the headless drummer did not appear during the siege. His warning had been delivered. His duty, for the moment, was complete. The courtyard stood empty at dusk, silent save for the wind and the distant sounds of the besieging army. Some of the garrison felt his absence more than they had felt his presence, finding the quiet courtyard somehow more unsettling than the sight of the phantom drummer. The siege lasted for 3 months. In March of 1651, with supplies running desperately low and no hope of relief, Captain Rutherford negotiated terms of surrender with Cromwell's forces. The garrison would be allowed to march out with honor, their lives spared in exchange for the castle's capitulation. On a grey morning, with mist rising from the Firth of Forth, the Scottish defenders left Edinburgh Castle, and English troops marched in to take their place. Years would pass before the headless drummer appeared again, but his legend lived on. Margaret Sinclair, now an old woman, would tell her grandchildren about the phantom she had seen, the boy soldier who marched without a head to warn of coming danger. Her tale would be passed down through generations, becoming one of Edinburgh's most enduring ghost stories. And sometimes, even now in the quiet hours after the tourists have departed and the castle stands empty under the Scottish sky, those who work within its walls report hearing it, faint but unmistakable, echoing through the centuries. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat, the eternal warning of the headless drummer boy. Chapter 2, Beneath the Stone. Time passed differently beneath Edinburgh. While the city above changed with seasons and centuries, the volcanic rock upon which it stood remained constant, ancient, immutable, hiding secrets in its dark heart. It was in the year when Queen Anne sat upon the British throne, when Scotland and England had newly joined in uneasy union, that Edinburgh Castle revealed one of its oldest mysteries. Robert MacLeod stood in the castle's lowest level, holding his torch high and peering at the stone wall before him. As the castle's master mason, he had been summoned to investigate a strange dampness that had been reported in one of the storage cellars. What he had found was far more intriguing than a simple leak. The wall before him was wrong. The stones didn't match the rest of the structure, and there was a subtle draft of cool air seeping through the mortar. "Duncan," he called to his apprentice, who stood nearby with tools. "Come feel this." Duncan Campbell, a sturdy young man with arms like tree trunks from years of working stone, pressed his palm against the wall. His eyes widened. "There's air moving through it, master, and these stones, they're not original work." "Exactly," Robert nodded. "Someone sealed something up here, and not very skillfully, which means they were in a hurry. Take down this section. Carefully now." As Duncan began to work, prying out stones and removing ancient mortar, a crowd began to gather. Servants, soldiers, and officers alike descended to the cellars, drawn by curiosity. Among them was Colonel William Macpherson, the castle's deputy governor, a sharp-eyed Scotsman who had fought in the recent wars. It took Duncan the better part of an hour to create an opening large enough for a man to fit through. As he pulled away the final stone, a gust of cold air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of earth and ages. Robert held his torch to the opening, and its light revealed what lay beyond. A tunnel, carved through the solid volcanic rock, stretching away into darkness. "My God," Colonel McPherson breathed. "How far does it go?" The tunnel was narrow, perhaps 4 feet wide and 5 feet high, but it was clearly ancient and deliberately made. The walls showed the marks of chisels and picks, thousands of strikes that had slowly hollowed out this passage through the basalt. The question was, where did it lead? Colonel McPherson made a decision. "We need someone to explore it, someone who can signal to us if it's safe." He paused, thinking. "We'll need a way to track their progress from above ground." "I'll go, sir." The voice came from the back of the crowd. A small figure pushed forward, a boy of perhaps 12 or 13 with red hair and bright eyes. "I'm Robbie McPhee, sir. I'm the castle piper's son. I can play as I go, so you can follow me from above. The pipes are loud enough you'll hear them through the rock." The boy was small enough to navigate the narrow tunnel easily. And the logic was sound. The bagpipes would be audible even through layers of stone and earth. They could track his progress through the city streets above. "It's dangerous, lad," the colonel warned. "We don't know what's down there." "I'm not afraid, sir," Robbie said, chin raised. "My father says a true piper never shirks his duty." And so it was decided. They outfitted young Robbie with a small lantern and gave him a length of rope tied around his waist, trailing behind him. Someone produced a compass, though its usefulness underground was questionable. The boy checked his bagpipes carefully. The bag made from deerskin, the drones carved from Highland oak, the chanter worn smooth by his father's hands before him. "What will you play?" someone asked. "The Bonnie Banks of Loch Lomond," Robbie replied. "It's a tune that carries well. You'll have no trouble following it." As the sun began to set outside the castle walls, Robbie McPhee stepped up to the opening in the wall. Above ground, soldiers positioned themselves at intervals along the Royal Mile, ready to track the sound of the pipes as the boy passed beneath them. "Remember," Colonel McPherson said, gripping the boy's shoulder. "At any sign of danger, any sign at all, you turn back. That's an order." "Aye, sir," Robbie promised. He took a deep breath, filled his pipes with air, and began to play. The opening notes of the Bonnie Banks of Loch Lomond rang out clear and true in the cellar. Then, still playing, Robbie ducked through the opening and entered the tunnel. The lantern light cast dancing shadows on the rock walls as he walked forward, his young fingers moving automatically over the chanter. Above ground, the soldiers heard it, the distinctive sound of bagpipes, muffled but unmistakable, rising from beneath the cobblestones. They marked Robbie's position, and as he moved forward, they followed along the surface, tracking his progress. For the first 100 yards, the tunnel ran straight and true, descending at a gentle angle deeper into the earth. Robbie's music echoed off the walls, and though the ceiling was low, the boy could walk upright without difficulty. The rope trailed behind him, a lifeline to the world above. Above ground, the trackers noted his steady progress down the Royal Mile, that famous street that connected Edinburgh Castle to the Palace of Holyrood House. The boy was making good time, his music never faltering. 200 yards, 300. The tunnel continued, sometimes widening into small chambers, other times narrowing so that Robbie had to turn sideways. But always it continued downward, deeper into the volcanic rock beneath Edinburgh. The basalt around him was black and hard as iron, unchanged since the fire that had formed it millions of years ago. At 400 yards, Robbie paused for a moment to rest his arms and refill his pipes with air. The silence when he stopped was absolute, no sound of wind, no drip of water, nothing but his own breathing and the hammering of his heart. He held up his lantern and peered ahead. The tunnel continued, but something felt different here. The air was colder, and there was a quality to it that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He was young, but he was a Highlander's son, raised on stories of kelpies and brownies, of fairy mounds and haunted glens. If the tunnel ahead was strange, well, that was all the more reason to see what lay at its end. He had given his word to the colonel, and a McPhee never broke his word. He began to play again, continuing his journey into the deep. 500 yards, 600. Above ground, the trackers followed the sound of his pipes past the high kirk of St. Giles, past the old Tolbooth, down toward the Tron Kirk that stood partway along the Royal Mile. The sound remained steady, clear, reassuring. At approximately 700 yards, near the Tron Kirk, young Robbie McPhee encountered something that would define Edinburgh's folklore for centuries to come. The tunnel had opened into a larger chamber, and Robbie straightened gratefully, his spine crackling. He held up his lantern to see better, and his breath caught in his throat. The chamber was filled with bones. Human bones scattered across the floor in profusion. Skulls grinned up at him from the shadows. Ribcages lay collapsed like broken baskets. This was not just a tunnel, it was a tomb, a mass grave of unimaginable age. Robbie's fingers faltered on the chanter, and the music stopped. Above ground, the soldiers froze. The pipes had ceased, suddenly and completely, near the Tron Kirk. They called out, hoping the boy might hear them through the earth, but there was only silence. In the chamber below, Robbie stood frozen, staring at the bones. And then he heard something that made his young heart nearly stop. A voice, singing. Faint, distant, echoing through passages that led deeper still into the earth. It was a mournful melody in a language he didn't understand, rising and falling like wind through a canyon. His lantern flickered, once, twice, and went out. The darkness that descended upon Robbie McPhee was absolute. He had never known such darkness. It pressed against his eyes, filled his mouth, made him feel as though he were drowning in black water. And in that darkness, the singing grew louder. His hands found his pipes through instinct. He filled the bag with a desperate breath and began to play, not the Bonnie Banks anymore, but a different tune, an older tune. Cumha na cloyne, the lament of the children. Above ground, the soldiers heard the pipes resume, but the tune had changed. The new melody was heart-wrenching, filled with a sorrow that seemed to rise from the very stones beneath their feet. "Pull him back," Colonel McPherson ordered. "Now." 3 strong soldiers grabbed the rope and began to haul. But instead of feeling the weight of a boy on the other end, they felt only slack. The rope came up easily, too easily. When they drew the end of the rope back through the opening in the cellar wall, their worst fears were confirmed. The rope had been cut, cleanly severed, as if by a sharp blade. And Robbie McPhee was still somewhere in the darkness below. Between one note and the next, the music stopped. The silence that followed was absolute and terrible. The gathered crowd stood frozen, listening desperately for any hint that the boy still lived. But there was nothing. "We're going after him," Robert MacLeod said, already moving toward the opening. But Colonel McPherson stopped him. "No, we don't know what happened. It could be a cave-in or foul air or—" He trailed off, unable to voice the darker possibilities. "We can't just leave him," Duncan Campbell shouted. "We won't," the colonel assured him. "But we need proper equipment and daylight. We'll mount a rescue at first light." At dawn, a well-equipped party descended into the tunnel. They carried lanterns, ropes, tools, and weapons. They followed the passage down, retracing Robbie's final journey. The tunnel was stable, dry, showing no signs of collapse. When they reached the bone chamber, approximately halfway between castle and palace, they found Robbie's lantern lying on the ground, its oil spent. But of the boy himself, there was no sign. No body, no blood, no indication of what had happened. Only his pipes remained, lying among the ancient bones. The search party explored every branch and passage, calling Robbie's name until their voices were hoarse. But the tunnels seemed to go on forever, a labyrinth beneath Edinburgh. After hours of fruitless searching, the colonel called off the attempt. They retrieved Robbie's pipes and sealed the tunnel entrance permanently, as their ancestors had done generations before. No one ever learned what had happened to young Robbie McPhee. He simply vanished, as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. But his spirit never left the tunnels. In the years and decades and centuries that followed, countless people would report hearing pipes playing beneath the streets of Edinburgh. The sound would echo up through cellar windows and coal chutes, drift out of storm drains and ancient wells. Sometimes it was the bonny banks of Loch Lomond, sometimes Cumha na cloyne, and sometimes tunes that no living piper knew. The sound always came from beneath the Royal Mile, from that haunted stretch between castle and palace where Robbie McPhee had made his final march. Workers digging sewers or laying cables would hear it. Late-night pedestrians would pause, certain they heard bagpipes from somewhere below their feet. And so Robbie McPhee played on through the centuries, a boy piper lost in darkness, still performing his duty, still trying to find his way home. His became one of Edinburgh's most persistent hauntings, a reminder that beneath the city of the living lay another city, a city of shadows and ancient bones, where spirits wandered through endless night. Chapter 3: The Vaults of Despair. The year was 1758, and Britain found itself once again at war. The 7 Years' War had spread across continents, from the forests of North America to the courts of Europe, from the coasts of India to the waters of the Caribbean. And to Edinburgh Castle, it brought an unexpected burden: prisoners. The stone vaults beneath Crown Square had never been built to house human beings. They had been designed as storage, meant for munitions, food supplies, and military equipment. The ceilings were low, barely 6 feet in places, and the walls wept with moisture even in summer. There were no windows, no proper ventilation, only a few carefully placed vents to allow some circulation of air. But war made desperate demands, and Edinburgh Castle's vaults found a new and grimmer purpose. Jacques Duchamp was among the first to arrive. He had been third mate aboard the French privateer Chevalier Barth when it was captured off the coast of Fife. Now, in the autumn of 1758, he stood shivering in the dim vault beneath the Great Hall, surrounded by dozens of other French sailors, all wondering what fate awaited them. "How long will they keep us here?" asked Pierre, a young sailor from Brest who still had the scared look of someone who thought he might wake from this nightmare. Jacques shook his head. "Until the war ends or until we're exchanged for British prisoners. Could be months, could be years." He was right to be pessimistic. The system of prisoner exchange that was supposed to see captured men returned home quickly had broken down under the weight of this global conflict. Edinburgh was far from the fighting, far from the ports where exchanges typically occurred. Men sent to the castle vaults could languish there for years. The conditions were harsh from the beginning. The vaults were cold and damp, the volcanic rock seeping moisture in all seasons. In winter, men huddled around the few small fireplaces that had been installed, sharing what warmth they could. In summer, the air grew thick and stale, hard to breathe when hundreds of men were packed into spaces meant for barrels and crates. But humans are remarkably adaptable creatures. As months turned into years, the prisoners created a life of sorts within their stone cage. They organized themselves, elected leaders from among their number, established rules and schedules. They found ways to pass the endless hours. Jean-Baptiste Moreau had been a carpenter before the war, and he possessed a gift for working with his hands. Using scraps of wood begged from the guards, fragments of bone from their meals, and any other materials he could acquire, he began to craft small objects. At first, it was just to keep his hands busy, to maintain his sanity in the face of endless boredom. But then the guards told him that prisoners were allowed to sell their wares to the public. "Every day," Sergeant Thompson explained in his thick Scottish burr, "between 10 in the morning and 3:30 in the afternoon, visitors can come to buy your crafts. You'll get to keep whatever money you make. Use it for tobacco, extra food, whatever you need." It wasn't freedom, but it was something. Jean-Baptiste threw himself into his work with renewed vigor. He carved intricate boxes from scraps of wood, made dice and checkers from bone, even attempted detailed ship models using whatever materials he could find. Other prisoners joined him. Men who had been bakers made bread to sell. Tailors created hats from straw. Artists drew portraits and sketches. The marketplace that developed in the castle became a strange intersection of two worlds. Edinburgh citizens would come to stare at the foreign prisoners, to buy exotic trinkets, to hear stories of distant seas and foreign lands. Some came out of curiosity, some out of pity, some because the craftsmanship was genuinely impressive. Young Hannah Stewart was one of the regular visitors. Her father was a merchant in the old town, and she would often accompany him on his trips to the castle. While he conducted business with the garrison, she would visit the marketplace, fascinated by the French sailors with their strange accents and sad eyes. "What is your name?" she asked one day, pointing to Jean-Baptiste's latest creation, a delicate wooden box carved with sailing ships. "Je m'appelle Jean-Baptiste," he replied, then corrected himself. "My name is Jean-Baptiste." "I'm Hannah. This box is beautiful. Did you make it yourself?" "Oui, yes. I was carpenter before the war." Over the following months, Hannah became a regular visitor, and Jean-Baptiste looked forward to her visits more than he cared to admit. She would bring him extra paper for sketching, pencils, sometimes a piece of fruit or a sweet biscuit. In return, he taught her French words, told her stories of his home in Marseille, of the brilliant blue Mediterranean Sea so different from the gray waters of the Firth of Forth. But not all the prisoners found such gentle ways to pass their time. Desperation and despair drove some to more drastic measures. In the summer of 1761, a group of French prisoners hatched an escape plan. They had noticed that the guards became less vigilant at night, that there were periods when the vaults were left with only minimal supervision. More importantly, they had discovered that the castle's waste, human waste, kitchen refuse, everything that couldn't be thrown from the walls, was collected in large carts and hauled down the castle rock each morning. "We hide in the dung cart," proposed Mitchell, a sailor who had been imprisoned for 3 years and was growing desperate. "They empty it outside the castle walls. We wait until they're not looking, then run." It was a terrible plan, risky, disgusting, with a very low chance of success. But after years in the vaults, terrible plans began to look like reasonable options. One night in July, 3 prisoners attempted it. Mitchell and 2 others concealed themselves in the waste cart, buried under refuse and filth, barely able to breathe through the stench. They felt the cart begin to move as morning arrived, heard the creak of wheels on stone as it was hauled toward the castle gate. But the guards were not as inattentive as the prisoners had hoped. When the cart reached the checkpoint, Sergeant Thompson personally inspected it, as he did most mornings. He didn't find the hiding men through diligence or suspicion. He found them because Mitchell, unable to bear the suffocating stench any longer, had begun to cough. The 3 were dragged from the cart, covered in filth and shame. They were placed in solitary confinement for 2 weeks, given only bread and water, made an example of what happened to those who tried to escape. "You're fortunate," Colonel Williamson told them afterward, "that we're bound by the rules of war to treat prisoners humanely. 100 years ago, you'd have been hanged for this." But the message was clear. Escape from Edinburgh Castle was virtually impossible. As the 7 Years' War finally ended in 1763, many of the French prisoners were repatriated. Jacques Duchamp, who had spent 5 years in the vaults, finally saw France again. Jean-Baptiste Moreau stood on the dock at Leith, breathing free air for the first time in years, and wept. But the vault's time, as a prison, was far from over. The American War of Independence brought a new wave of captives. American sailors, many of them colonists who had never thought of themselves as enemies of Britain, found themselves locked in the same cold vaults where French prisoners had languished. They carved their names into the doors, scratched their stories into the stone. One patriotic prisoner even etched a crude version of the new American flag, the stars and stripes, into a door, a symbol of defiance and hope. Then came the Napoleonic Wars, and with them a flood of French prisoners unlike anything the castle had seen before. By 1810, the vaults were packed beyond capacity. Up to 1,000 men were crammed into spaces meant for a fraction of that number, with less than a square meter per person. The air was thick and foul, the conditions miserable. In 1811, desperation reached a breaking point. A group of 49 prisoners discovered a section of the castle's south wall that had been poorly maintained. Over weeks of careful work, they chipped away at the mortar, working in shifts, hiding their activity from the guards. Finally, on a dark October night, they broke through. The escape was remarkably successful. 48 of the 49 men made it safely down the treacherous castle rock. But Edinburgh was not a large city, and 48 foreign sailors wandering the streets did not go unnoticed for long. Within days, all had been recaptured and returned to the castle. It was this mass escape that finally convinced the authorities that the vaults were unsuitable as a prison. In 1814, As the Napoleonic Wars drew to a close, Edinburgh Castle ceased to be used for housing prisoners of war. But the men who had lived and suffered there left something behind. The prisoners had carved their marks into every available surface. Names, dates, ships, messages to loved ones they would never see again. The wooden doors bore the deepest marks, hundreds of inscriptions scratched with whatever implements the men could find. Jean Morrow, 1756. Thomas Brown, Boston, 1777. Pierre Aubert died here, 1813. These weren't just historical curiosities. They were the last words of desperate men, prayers carved in wood and stone, final testimonies of lives lived in darkness and cold. And with such concentrated suffering, such despair etched into the very fabric of the place, it was perhaps inevitable that something would linger. The guards were the first to notice, even after the last prisoners had been released or transferred. Even after the vaults had been emptied and cleaned, strange things began to happen. Sergeant William Mackenzie had been assigned to oversee the conversion of the vaults back to storage in 1815. He was a practical man, not given to superstition, but even he couldn't deny what he experienced in those deep chambers. "I heard voices," he reported to Colonel Stewart, his superior officer. "Men speaking in French. I went to investigate, thinking perhaps some prisoners had been left behind, but the vault was empty, completely empty. But I could still hear them, whispers, conversations, as if a dozen men stood just beyond the next door." Colonel Stewart frowned. "You were tired, Sergeant. These vaults play tricks with sound. Echoes can." "It wasn't echoes, sir," Mackenzie interrupted, then quickly apologized for his impertinence. "Begging your pardon, but I know what I heard, and there's more. Cold spots in certain areas, so cold your breath mists even in summer. Shadows that move when there's nothing to cast them. And the feeling," he paused, struggling to put it into words, "the feeling that you're being watched, that you're not alone." Over the following decades, as the castle continued its function as a military garrison and armory, reports of strange occurrences in the old prison vaults multiplied. Soldiers assigned to retrieve supplies from below would return pale-faced, insisting they had seen figures moving in the darkness, men in ragged clothes, speaking in foreign tongues. Some reported feeling hands grabbing at them, though nothing was there when they turned to look. In 1888, Private James Morrison was found unconscious in one of the lower vaults. When he revived in the infirmary, he told a disturbing story. "I went down to fetch rope from the stores," he said, his voice shaking. "And I saw them, dozens of them, men in old-fashioned clothes, French sailors by the look of them. They were just standing there, staring at me. I tried to run, but it was like moving through water. I felt hands on me, pulling at me, and then nothing. I don't remember anything else until I woke here." The doctor attributed it to a seizure or perhaps a fall that had knocked him unconscious. But Morrison swore by his story until his dying day, and he refused ever to enter the lower vaults again. The 20th century brought new uses for the castle. It became a tourist attraction, a symbol of Scotland's heritage, a monument to be preserved and displayed. But the vaults beneath Crown Square remained largely closed to the public, too eerie, too unsettling for casual visitors. It was the prisoners' marks, those desperate carvings on doors and walls, that provided the most tangible connection to the suffering that had occurred here. Historians and archaeologists who studied them reported feeling profound sadness when touching the inscriptions, as if the emotions of the men who had carved them had somehow been absorbed into the wood and stone. Dr. Eleanor Fraser, a historian specializing in military prisons, spent months in the 1970s cataloging and photographing every inscription in the vaults. Her work was groundbreaking, but it took a toll on her. "I would dream about them," she wrote in her journal. "The prisoners. I would hear their voices, see their faces. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night with the absolute certainty that someone was in my bedroom, watching me. I felt their desperation, their loneliness, their fear. It was as if, by studying their marks, I had made myself available to them somehow, as if they were using me to tell their stories." She completed her work, publishing a definitive study of the Edinburgh Castle prison vaults, but she never returned to the castle afterward. "I can't," she told a colleague. "They're still there, still suffering, and I can't bear to feel it again." As the centuries passed since the last prisoner walked free from those vaults, the hauntings continued. Castle staff reported hearing moans and cries echoing from below, the rattle of chains, the shuffle of feet on stone. Some claimed to smell the scent of unwashed bodies, of sickness and despair. Others reported seeing spectral figures, gaunt men in tattered clothes, their eyes hollow with hopelessness. The most frequently reported apparition was that of a tall, thin man in what appeared to be a French naval uniform from the Napoleonic era. He was seen most often near the door where someone had carved, "Pierre Aubert, died here, 1813. Those who encountered him reported an overwhelming sense of sadness, and some claimed he tried to speak to them, his lips moving though no sound emerged. Was it Pierre Aubert himself, unable to rest after dying so far from home? Or was it a composite, the collected suffering of all the prisoners who had endured the vaults, manifesting in a form that visitors could perceive? The vaults held other spirits too. American prisoners from the Revolutionary War, their presence marked by phantom voices speaking in accents from Boston and Virginia and the Carolinas. French sailors from the 7 Years' War, still conducting their quiet commerce, still crafting their desperate wares. All of them trapped, in some sense, by the intensity of their suffering, by the marks they had left on this place. In 2003, during renovation work in the vaults, construction workers refused to continue their assignment. 3 different work crews, brought in one after another, all reported the same experiences. Tools going missing and reappearing in different locations, cold spots that defied explanation, the feeling of being watched and followed. One worker was found outside the vault, visibly shaken, claiming that something had pushed him from behind when he was alone in a chamber. The renovations were completed eventually, but only with great difficulty. The castle authorities, by this point, had quietly accepted what the staff had known for years. The old prison vaults were haunted, not in the sense of Victorian ghost stories or Halloween myths, but in a deeper, more troubling way. The suffering of those who had been imprisoned there had left an indelible mark on the place, a psychic residue that persisted centuries after the last prisoner had departed. Today, parts of the old prison vaults are included in Castle Tour, and visitors are shown the prisoners' marks, those desperate inscriptions carved into wood and stone. The tour guides tell the stories of the dung cart escape attempt, of the men who crafted beautiful objects in the midst of despair, of the thousands who languished for years in darkness and cold. But what the guides sometimes don't mention, what they don't always know themselves, is that the prisoners are still there in some sense, still carving their names, still calling out in foreign tongues, still trying to tell their stories to anyone who will listen. The vaults beneath Edinburgh Castle hold more than history. They hold the echoes of suffering, the residue of despair, the shadows of men who died far from home and whose spirits may never find their way back. Chapter 4, Spirits in the Shadows. Year was 2003, and Edinburgh Castle was undergoing one of its periodic renovations. Centuries of weather, war, and wear had taken their toll on certain sections of the fortress, and the Scottish Heritage Organisation responsible for its maintenance had commissioned extensive restoration work. It was during this project that the castle's various hauntings converged in a way that would be recorded and studied more thoroughly than any previous paranormal activity in the fortress's long history. Dr. Richard Weissman was a psychologist from the University of Hertfordshire who specialized in the scientific investigation of paranormal claims. He was, by nature and training, a skeptic, someone who sought rational explanations for phenomena that others attributed to ghosts or spirits. When he was invited to conduct a study in Edinburgh Castle, he saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate how psychology and environmental factors could explain most alleged hauntings. He would leave Edinburgh with his skepticism significantly shaken. "We're going to approach this scientifically," he told his research team as they set up their equipment in April 2003. "We'll measure temperature variations, air pressure, electromagnetic fields, infrasound, anything that might cause people to feel uncomfortable or experience hallucinations. We'll map the spaces, interview witnesses, and see if we can find patterns." His team included technicians, psychologists, and volunteers who would walk through various parts of the castle, including the old prison vaults and the underground chambers, and report their experiences. These volunteers were not told where alleged hauntings had occurred. They were simply asked to note any unusual sensations, feelings, or perceptions. The results were startling. Over 240 volunteers participated in the study, walking through different sections of the castle. Without any prior knowledge of the location's history or reputation, they consistently reported unusual experiences in specific areas. The old prison vaults beneath Crown Square produced the most dramatic responses. Volunteers reported feeling watched, experiencing sudden temperature drops, and in several cases, reporting the sensation of being touched by unseen hands. But it was the deeper, older parts of the castle, the chambers that dated back centuries before the prison vaults, that produced the most interesting data. Sarah Chen was one of the volunteers. She was a graduate student in biology, as far from believer in ghosts as one could imagine. She had signed up for the study partly out of curiosity and partly because the small payment would help with her rent. She expected to walk through some old rooms, feel nothing unusual, and collect her money. She was wrong. I entered one of the lower chambers, she reported afterward, her voice still shaky, and immediately felt like I couldn't breathe. Not like the air was bad, more like there was pressure on my chest. I felt intensely sad, like I might cry, even though I had no reason to feel that way. And then, she paused, struggling to continue. I saw her, just for a second, a woman in old-fashioned clothes, gray or silver, standing in the corner. She was looking at me with the saddest expression I've ever seen. I blinked and she was gone. Dr. Weissman interviewed Sarah extensively. She had no prior knowledge of the castle's hauntings, no particular interest in the paranormal, and no obvious psychological issues that might cause hallucinations. Yet her description matched accounts that dated back decades, accounts she couldn't have known about. She had seen the Grey Lady. Lady Janet Douglas, Countess of Glamis, had been one of Edinburgh Castle's most tragic residents. In 1537, she had been accused of witchcraft and treason by King James V, who despised her family. The charges were almost certainly false, a political vendetta disguised as justice. She was imprisoned in Edinburgh Castle, tortured, and finally burned at the stake on Castle Hill. Her spirit, according to centuries of reports, had never left. The Grey Lady, as she came to be known, was seen most often in the areas where Lady Janet had been imprisoned. Witnesses described her as a tall, elegant woman in gray or silver clothing, her face beautiful but marked by immense sorrow. She never spoke, never made any threatening gestures. She simply appeared, gazed at the living with those unbearably sad eyes, and vanished. What made Sarah's sighting particularly significant was that it occurred in an area of the castle that had been closed to the public for years. She couldn't have been influenced by tourist tailies or popular ghost stories. Yet her description matched historical accounts with uncanny accuracy. As Dr. Weissman's study continued, more volunteers reported similar experiences. A pattern emerged. Certain areas of the castle consistently produced specific types of experiences. The old prison vaults created feelings of despair and claustrophobia. The chambers near the Great Hall produced sensations of being watched. And the deepest, oldest parts of the castle, the sections that dated back to the medieval period, produced the most varied and intense experiences. We can explain some of it, Dr. Weissman admitted in his preliminary report. Temperature variations, unusual acoustics, electromagnetic fluctuations, these can all affect human perception and create uncomfortable sensations. But they don't explain the consistency of the reports, the specific details that match historical records, or the fact that people with no prior knowledge are reporting the same experiences in the same locations. Michael Torres, one of the study's technicians, had an experience that would haunt him for years afterward. He was setting up equipment in one of the lower storage vaults when he heard something that made him freeze, the sound of a drum beating in steady rhythm. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. I thought someone was playing a joke, he said later. I called out asking who was there, no response, but the drumming continued. I followed the sound through the corridors and it seemed to be coming from the central courtyard above, but when I went up there, it stopped. The courtyard was empty. Michael had never heard the legend of the Headless Drummer. He was a technician from London, focused on his electromagnetic field readings and temperature sensors. He had no reason to fabricate a story about a phantom drum, yet his experience matched accounts dating back to 1650. The study revealed something else that Dr. Weissman found particularly intriguing. The hauntings seemed to be connected. Different witnesses, in different parts of the castle, reported experiences that appeared to be related to each other, as if the various spirits were aware of each other's presence. Emma MacLeod, a local woman who worked as a cleaner in the castle, had worked there for 15 years and had her own experiences to share. Dr. Weissman interviewed her extensively, fascinated by her matter-of-fact acceptance of the castle's ghosts. "You get used to them," she said with a slight shrug. "The prisoners in the vaults, they're the saddest. You can hear them sometimes talking in French or English with strange accents. They don't mean any harm, they're just still here somehow, still living through their imprisonment." "And the others?" Dr. Weissman prompted. "The Gray Lady, she appears mostly in the old chambers. She's looking for something, I think. Justice, maybe, or just recognition of what was done to her. And then there's the Piper. You can hear him sometimes, playing under the Royal Mile. That one's eerie because you know he's lost down there in the dark and he can't find his way out." "Do you ever see them interact?" Dr. Weissman asked. "The different ghosts, I mean." Emma considered this. "Not directly, but sometimes. Sometimes it feels like they're all part of the same thing, you know? Like the castle itself remembers everything that happened here, and all these spirits are just different pieces of that memory." It was an unusually poetic observation from a woman who prided herself on practical common sense, but Dr. Weissman found himself agreeing with her. The more he studied Edinburgh Castle's hauntings, the more they seemed to form a cohesive whole rather than isolated incidents. One night, near the end of the study, Dr. Weissman had his own unexplainable experience. He was working late, reviewing audio recordings from the day's sessions. Most of it was mundane: footsteps, voices of volunteers, the ambient noise of an old building. But on one recording, taken in the deepest part of the old prison vaults, he heard something that made his blood run cold. It was a voice speaking in French. The words were clear despite the centuries-old accent. "ESDC quelqu'un peut nous entendre." Is anyone able to hear us? Dr. Weissman played it back multiple times. It wasn't a whisper or an ambiguous sound that could be interpreted as words. It was a clear, distinct voice, speaking a complete sentence in 18th century French. And according to his equipment logs, there had been no one in that vault when the recording was made. He sat in his makeshift office in the castle, staring at the audio waveform on his computer screen, and felt everything he thought he knew about reality shift slightly. As a scientist, he couldn't accept ghosts, but as an honest researcher, he couldn't deny what he had just heard. The study concluded in June 2003, and Dr. Weissman published his findings in a carefully worded report. He noted the unusual consistency of experiences, the correlation between reported phenomena and historical events, and the physical anomalies his team had measured. He stopped short of declaring the castle haunted in any supernatural sense, but he acknowledged that something extraordinary was occurring there. Whether these experiences represent genuine paranormal activity, some form of environmental influence we don't yet understand, or a complex interaction between place and psychology, he wrote, "Edinburgh Castle presents one of the most compelling cases for unusual phenomena I have encountered in my career." The study brought renewed attention to Edinburgh Castle's ghosts, but for those who worked there daily, nothing had really changed. The spirits were still present, still making themselves known in subtle and sometimes dramatic ways. In 2008, a security guard named Thomas Grant was making his routine patrol through the castle in the early hours of the morning. It was February, cold and dark, with a thin mist hanging over Castle Rock. As he walked through the central courtyard, he saw a figure ahead of him, small, marching in a circle, beating a drum. Thomas's first thought was that someone had broken in, perhaps a reenactor or a prankster. He called out, reaching for his radio to call for backup. But as he did, the figure passed through a shaft of moonlight, and Thomas saw clearly that it had no head. He stood frozen, watching the headless drummer complete its circuit once, twice, 3 times. The sound of the drum was clear and distinct in the cold night air. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. And then, between one step and the next, the figure simply faded away, becoming transparent and then vanishing entirely. Thomas Grant had worked security for 12 years and considered himself a level-headed, practical man. But that night shook him deeply. He submitted a formal report of what he had witnessed, knowing it would sound absurd, but feeling compelled to document what he had seen. What he didn't know, what no one told him, was that his sighting had historical significance. According to tradition, the headless drummer appeared as a warning, as it had in 1650 before Cromwell's siege. Within 2 months of Thomas's sighting, the 2008 global financial crisis began, eventually devastating Scotland's economy and leading to significant hardship throughout the country. Was it coincidence? Or had the drummer resumed his centuries-old duty, warning of approaching danger? The castle's paranormal activity continued to manifest in various forms. Visitors reported seeing the Grey Lady, feeling the despair of the prison vaults, hearing pipes playing beneath their feet. Each experience added to the growing body of evidence that Edinburgh Castle was home to something beyond the purely physical, a collection of spirits, memories, and energies that refused to fade with time. Dr. Fiona Campbell, a parapsychologist from the University of Edinburgh, conducted a follow-up study in 2015. Her approach was different from Dr. Weissman's. Where he had sought natural explanations, she was willing to consider the possibility of genuine paranormal phenomena. What we're seeing here, she concluded in her report, is a location where the veil between past and present appears to be unusually thin. The intense emotions associated with this place, fear, despair, hope, defiance, seem to have left an impression on the environment itself. Whether we call these impressions ghosts, or psychic residue, or temporal anomalies, is less important than acknowledging that they exist and can be experienced by ordinary people under ordinary circumstances. Her study documented over 100 new experiences, ranging from mild sensations of unease to full apparitions and auditory phenomena. The pattern remained consistent with historical reports, suggesting that whatever was occurring in Edinburgh Castle was stable and ongoing, not a temporary phenomenon or mass delusion. Perhaps the most poignant testimony came from an elderly Frenchman named Jean-Claude Moreau, who visited the castle in 2017. He was the great-great-great-grandson of Jean-Baptiste Moreau, the carpenter who had been imprisoned in the vaults during the 7 Years' War. "I came to see where my ancestor suffered," he explained to a castle historian. "I wanted to understand what he endured." When Jean-Claude entered the old prison vaults, he immediately began to weep. "I can feel him here," he said. "After all these centuries, something of him remains. His sorrow, his hope, his determination to survive. It's all still here in these stones." The historian guided Jean-Claude to the door where many French prisoners had carved their names. Though Jean-Baptiste Moreau's own inscription had long since worn away, other names from his era remained visible. Jean-Claude traced them with his fingers, connecting with a past that suddenly seemed very present. "They should be at peace," he said softly. "They should be allowed to rest. They suffered enough in life." But peace, it seemed, was not easily found in Edinburgh Castle. The spirits remained, the hauntings continued, and the ancient fortress kept its secrets while simultaneously revealing them to those who were willing to see. Chapter 5: Echoes Through Time. The summer of 2024 brought record numbers of tourists to Edinburgh Castle. The fortress sat as it always had atop Castle Rock, its ancient stones warmed by the Scottish sun, its battlements crowded with visitors from around the world. Tour guides led groups through the Great Hall, the Royal Palace, and St. Margaret's Chapel. They told stories of kings and queens, of sieges and battles, of Scotland's tumultuous history. And increasingly, they told stories of ghosts. Amanda Chen was one of those tourists. She had flown from Singapore to Scotland as part of a month-long European vacation, and Edinburgh Castle was at the top of her must-see list. She was a software engineer, 28 years old, rational and pragmatic by nature. She didn't believe in ghosts, but she enjoyed historical sites and was fascinated by the castle's role in Scottish history. She had no idea that her visit would change her understanding of reality. The tour began in the courtyard, where Margaret Sinclair had first seen the Headless Drummer nearly 4 centuries earlier. Amanda took photos, half listening to the guide's narration about military history and architectural features. It was all interesting enough, but she found her attention wandering. Then the guide mentioned the Headless Drummer. "One of the castle's most famous ghosts," the guide said, his Scottish accent making the story sound both authentic and slightly theatrical, "is the phantom drummer boy who appears before times of danger. First seen in 1650 before Cromwell's attack, he's been spotted numerous times throughout the centuries, always marching in a circle through this very courtyard, beating his drum even though he has no head." The group laughed nervously, and someone made a joke about Scottish whiskey. But Amanda felt something odd, a sudden chill despite the warm summer air, a sensation of being watched. She looked around the courtyard, seeing nothing but other tourists and the ancient stone walls. Yet the feeling persisted. The tour moved on, descending into the lower levels of the castle. The guide led them through narrow corridors and down steep stairs, explaining how the fortress had been built layer upon layer over centuries. They passed through rooms that had served as barracks, storage chambers, and meeting halls. Then they reached the old prison vaults. The change in atmosphere was immediate and dramatic. The air grew colder, though there was no obvious source of draft. The low ceilings and rough stone walls seemed to press in on the group. Several tourists visibly uncomfortable, shuffling closer together as if for protection. These vaults served as prisons from 1757 until 1814, the guide explained. During that time, thousands of prisoners were held here, French, American, and others. The conditions were harsh. Men were crammed into spaces meant for storage, with little food, poor sanitation, and no hope of release until the wars ended or they were exchanged. He pointed to one of the massive wooden doors, its surface covered with inscriptions. The prisoners carved their names, their ships, messages to loved ones. "Look here, you can see the marks they left behind." Amanda approached the door, drawn by curiosity. The inscriptions were everywhere: names, dates, crude drawings of ships and anchors. She reached out to touch one that read, "Pier Abbott, died here, 1813. The moment her fingers made contact with the carving, everything changed. The sound hit her first, voices, dozens of them speaking in French. Then came the smell, unwashed bodies, damp stone, sickness, and despair. The temperature plummeted, her breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. And then she saw them. The vault was full of men. They stood, sat, lay on the floor, dozens of gaunt figures in tattered naval uniforms and ragged civilian clothes. Some were working on small crafts, carving wood or bone. Others huddled around a small fire that gave no heat. All of them looked malnourished, exhausted, hopeless, and all of them were staring at her. Amanda gasped and jerked her hand away from the door. Instantly, the vision vanished. The vault was empty again, containing only her tour group and the guide, who was continuing his narration, unaware that anything unusual had occurred. But one of the other tourists, an elderly woman, was looking at Amanda with knowing eyes. "You saw them, didn't you?" she whispered. Amanda could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. "I've visited this castle 3 times, the woman continued quietly. "Every time I see something different. Last time I heard bagpipes playing beneath my feet. The time before I saw a woman in gray in one of the upper chambers. This place is alive in a way that's hard to explain." The tour continued, but Amanda found it difficult to concentrate. Her rational mind was trying to process what had happened, offering explanations. Mass hallucination, low oxygen levels, suggestion from the guide's stories. But none of these explanations felt adequate. What she had experienced had been too vivid, too detailed, too real. When the tour reached the section about the lost piper, Amanda listened with new attention. "Centuries ago," the guide explained, "a young boy was sent into the tunnels beneath the castle, playing his bagpipes so people above ground could follow his progress. The music stopped near the Tron Kirk, about halfway down the Royal Mile, and the boy was never seen again. But to this day, people report hearing pipes playing beneath the streets of Edinburgh. As if on cue, Amanda heard it, faint but distinct, the sound of bagpipes echoing from somewhere below. She looked around the group, trying to determine if anyone else heard it, but their faces showed no reaction. The sound continued for perhaps 30 seconds, a melancholy tune that seemed to come from impossibly deep beneath the earth, and then faded away. Amanda's phone was in her hand. She had been about to take a photo, but instead, she opened her voice recorder app and held it up, hopping to capture the sound. But when she played it back later, there was nothing, just the guide's voice and the ambient noise of the tour group. The tour concluded in the castle's upper levels, with a visit to the Royal Palace and St. Margaret's Chapel. As the group was dismissed, Amanda lingered behind, approaching the guide. "The prisoner vaults," she said hesitantly. "Have other people reported seeing things there?" The guide's professional smile shifted into something more genuine. "All the time," he said quietly. "I've worked here for 8 years, given this tour hundreds of times, and I'd say at least once a month, someone sees or experiences something they can't explain. Usually in the vaults, sometimes in the older chambers. Once in a while, someone sees the Grey Lady." "Does it ever bother you?" Amanda asked. "Working in a place that's so haunted?" The guide considered this. "Not really. I think of it as a privilege, actually. These spirits, if that's what they are, they're trying to tell us something. About suffering, about courage, about the human experience in extreme circumstances. Ignoring them would be like ignoring history itself." As Amanda left the castle, walking down the steep approach toward the Royal Mile, she found herself thinking about what the guide had said. The ghosts of Edinburgh Castle weren't malevolent, they were witnesses. They were the accumulated memories of centuries of human drama, preserved somehow in stone and air, waiting to be acknowledged. That evening, back in her hotel, Amanda couldn't stop thinking about her experience. She began researching Edinburgh Castle's hauntings online, discovering the scientific studies, the historical accounts, the countless testimonies from people who had experienced something inexplicable within those ancient walls. She found Dr. Weissman's 2003 study and was amazed to discover that her experience matched patterns documented over 20 years earlier. She read about the Headless Drummer, about young Robbie McPhee lost in the tunnels, about the thousands of prisoners who had suffered in the vaults. Each story added depth to what she had experienced, transforming it from an isolated incident into part of a much larger phenomenon. The next morning, Amanda did something she hadn't planned. She returned to the castle. This time, she skipped the tour and explored on her own, focusing on the areas where she had felt the strongest sensations. She spent an hour in the old prison vaults, sitting quietly, trying to understand what she had experienced. The prisoners' marks on the doors seemed to speak to her now. Each inscription represented a real person, someone who had lived and suffered and hoped and despaired in this very place. Pierre Abbott, who had died here in 1813. Thomas Brown from Boston, captured during the American Revolution. Jean Morrow from 1756, whose descendant would visit this same spot 2.5 centuries later. As she sat there in the quiet vault, Amanda felt something shift in her understanding. Ghosts weren't about proof or evidence or scientific validation. They were about connection, about recognizing that the past wasn't really past at all, that suffering echoed through time, that human experiences left marks that transcended mere physical reality. She heard footsteps and turned to see a castle employee, Emma MacLeod, though Amanda didn't know her name. The older woman was carrying cleaning supplies, going about her daily work. "You're feeling it, aren't you?" Emma said, not unkindly. "The weight of this place." "I saw them yesterday," Amanda admitted. "The prisoners. When I touched one of the inscriptions, I saw them all as clear as I'm seeing you now." Emma nodded as if this was the most natural thing in the world. "That happens sometimes. The door remember, you see. They absorbed all those men's despair, their hope, their determination to be remembered. When someone touches them with the right kind of openness, all that comes flooding back." "Do you believe in ghosts?" Amanda asked. Emma smiled. "I believe this place is special. Whether you call what's here ghosts or memories or psychic impressions doesn't much matter. What matters is that people suffered here, and that suffering deserves to be acknowledged, not dismissed or explained away. Over the next few days, as Amanda continued her vacation through Scotland, she found herself thinking often about Edinburgh Castle. She had come to Scotland for history and scenery, for culture and adventure. What she had found was something deeper, a confrontation with the reality that the past was never truly gone, that pain and hope and human experience left marks that persisted across centuries. On her last day in Edinburgh, Amanda made one final visit to the castle. It was late afternoon, and the tour groups had thinned out. She stood in the central courtyard as the sun began to set, painting the stone walls in shades of gold and amber. And then she heard it, rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. The sound of a drum, steady and rhythmic, echoing off the ancient walls. Amanda turned slowly, her heart racing, and saw him, a small figure in a drummer's uniform, marching in a perfect circle around the courtyard. Where his head should have been, there was only empty air. She wasn't frightened. Instead, she felt a profound sadness, a recognition of duty performed across centuries, of a warning given again and again to those who might hear it. The drummer completed 3 circuits of the courtyard, his phantom drum beating steadily, and then faded away like mist in morning sun. Amanda Chen boarded her flight back to Singapore 2 days later, her mind full of questions, but also of certainties. She couldn't prove what she had experienced in Edinburgh Castle. She had no photographs of ghosts, no recordings of phantom pipes, no scientific evidence to present. But she knew, with a certainty that transcended rational doubt, that something extraordinary existed within those ancient walls. She wasn't alone in this knowledge. Thousands of others had experienced the castle's ghosts over the centuries, from Margaret Sinclair in 1650 to Thomas Grant in 2008, to countless unnamed visitors who had seen, heard, or felt things they couldn't explain. The ghosts of Edinburgh Castle endured not because they were trying to frighten the living, but because they were trying to speak to them. The headless drummer beat his warning. Young Robbie McPhee played his pipes in the endless dark beneath the Royal Mile. The prisoners in the vaults carved their names and called out in foreign tongues. Lady Janet Douglas, the Grey Lady, gazed with sad eyes at the living, seeking recognition of the injustice done to her. All of them were witnesses, testifying to the truth that human experience, especially suffering, leaves marks that transcend time and space. Edinburgh Castle, built on its volcanic throne of ancient rock, had absorbed centuries of human drama. Joy and sorrow, courage and despair, life and death, all of it had soaked into the stones, creating a place where the boundary between past and present grew thin. And so the hauntings continued, as they likely always would. As long as Edinburgh Castle stood, as long as people walked its corridors and climbed its stairs and touched its ancient stones, the spirits would remain. Not as curiosities or tourist attractions, but as reminders of history, of humanity, of the enduring power of memory. On quiet evenings, after the last tour has departed and the castle gates are locked, the ghosts come out. The drummer marches his eternal circuit. The pipes play beneath the Royal Mile. The prisoners speak in whispered French and accented English. The Grey Lady walks her ancient chambers, forever seeking justice that will never come. And the stones of Edinburgh Castle, which have witnessed everything, remember it all. The fortress stands as it has for centuries, a sentinel overlooking the city, holding within its walls the accumulated memories of human experience, triumph and tragedy, hope and despair, life and death. It is a place where the past refuses to remain past, where spirits walk among the living, where the boundary between then and now becomes permeable. In the years that followed Amanda Chen's visit, the castle's reputation as one of the world's most haunted locations only grew stronger. Paranormal investigators came with increasingly sophisticated equipment, documenting temperature anomalies, electromagnetic fluctuations, and unexplained audio phenomena. Skeptics came seeking to debunk the legends, only to leave with experiences they couldn't explain. And ordinary tourists, expecting nothing more than a history lesson, found themselves confronting something far more profound. Dr. James McAllister, a historian specializing in Scottish military history, accepted a position as the castle's chief historian in 2019. He was a scholar, a man of facts and documents, and he approached his new role with academic rigor. He had read the reports of hauntings, of course, but considered them folklore, interesting stories that added color to the historical record, but not to be taken literally. His first night working late in the castle archives changed his perspective entirely. It was November, and darkness had fallen early. Dr. McAllister was alone in a small office in one of the older sections of the castle, surrounded by documents dating back to the 17th century. He was researching the siege of 1650, trying to correlate garrison records with contemporary accounts of Cromwell's assault. At approximately 9 o'clock, he heard it. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. The sound was faint at first, as if coming from a great distance, but it grew steadily louder, approaching through the corridors outside his office. Dr. McAllister stood, moving to his door. The drumming was unmistakable now, the steady military rhythm of a drummer beating cadence. He opened the door and looked out into the corridor. It was empty, lit only by emergency lights that cast long shadows. But the drumming continued, passing right by his doorway. Dr. McAllister felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. He could hear it clearly, the drum, the footsteps marching in time, but he could see nothing. The sound continued down the corridor, growing fainter, until it faded away entirely. Dr. McAllister stood in his doorway for several long minutes, his heart pounding. He was a rational man, a scholar who dealt in evidence and documentation, but he had just heard something that should not exist. The next morning, he began a new research project, a comprehensive study of the castle's documented hauntings, treating them not as folklore, but as historical phenomena worthy of serious investigation. His work would reveal patterns that previous researchers had missed. The headless drummer, he discovered, appeared not randomly, but in cycles. Every appearance was documented in periods preceding significant conflict or disaster: Cromwell's siege in 1650, the Jacobite Rising of 1745, World War I, the 2008 financial crisis. The drummer was indeed a harbinger, though what mechanism allowed a spirit to perceive future dangers remained inexplicable. The lost piper's music, meanwhile, seemed to respond to emotional distress in the living. People going through difficult times, grief, depression, major life crises, were significantly more likely to hear the pipes than others. It was as if young Robbie McPhee, still lost in his eternal darkness, was drawn to the pain of others, perhaps seeking comfort or offering company to fellow sufferers. The prisoner's spirits showed the most complex patterns. They appeared most frequently to visitors from France and America, descendants, perhaps unconsciously, of the men who had been imprisoned there. Jean-Claude Moreau's experience in 2017 was not unique. Dr. McAllister documented dozens of similar cases where French visitors reported profound emotional experiences in the vaults, sometimes seeing full apparitions of prisoners who matched descriptions of their own ancestors. And the Grey Lady, Lady Janet Douglas, appeared most often to women who had experienced injustice. Several documented encounters came from women who had recently been through difficult legal battles, accusations of wrongdoing, or betrayals by authorities. The spirit seemed to recognize kindred experiences across the centuries. "What we're seeing," Dr. McAllister wrote in his groundbreaking 2022 paper, "is not random haunting, but rather a complex interaction between historical trauma, present emotion, and the unique properties of this location. Edinburgh Castle appears to function as a kind of temporal junction, where past and present overlap in ways that allow certain sensitive individuals to perceive events and persons from other times." His work brought new legitimacy to the study of the castle's paranormal phenomena, but it also raised troubling questions. If the spirits were real, if they were genuinely the consciousness or essence of people who had died centuries ago, what did that mean about the nature of death itself? Were these souls trapped, unable to move on? Or were they choosing to remain, driven by unfinished business or duty that transcended mortality? In the summer of 2023, an event occurred that seemed to provide at least a partial answer. Sister Catherine Morrison was a Catholic nun from Ireland who visited Edinburgh Castle as part of a pilgrimage tour. She was elderly, in her late 70s, with a lifetime of faith and service behind her. She had come to Scotland to visit sites associated with St. Margaret, the medieval queen who had been canonized for her piety and charity. When her tour group entered the old prison vaults, Sister Catherine felt immediately drawn to one particular door. She approached it slowly, her fingers finding the carved inscriptions. One name seemed to call to her: Pier Aubert mort Isai, 1813. Pier Aubert died here, 1813. Sister Catherine began to pray not a formal prayer, but a simple, heartfelt appeal. "May you find peace," she whispered in French, her fingers tracing the carved letters. "May you finally go home. Your suffering is acknowledged, your memory honored. You need not remain here any longer." What happened next was witnessed by 3 tour guides, 4 castle employees, and 17 tourists. The air in the vault grew suddenly warm, not uncomfortably hot, but pleasantly, almost lovingly warm like a summer breeze. A scent filled the space, lavender and something else, something that smelled like the sea. And for just a moment, everyone present saw him, a tall, thin man in a tattered French naval uniform, standing by the door where his name was carved. He was smiling. The apparition lasted perhaps 5 seconds. The man, Pier Aubert, if that's who it was, looked at Sister Catherine with an expression of profound gratitude. He nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement and farewell. And then he faded away, not suddenly but gradually, like morning mist dissolving in sunlight. Sister Catherine, tears streaming down her face, made the sign of the cross. "He's gone," she said softly. "Finally, he's gone home." In the weeks that followed, castle employees reported a subtle but noticeable change in the atmosphere of the vaults. The oppressive feeling of despair that had always characterized that particular section seemed lessened somehow. And while other prisoners' spirits continued to make their presence known, no one reported seeing or sensing Pier Aubert again. It was as if Sister Catherine's prayer, her acknowledgement of his suffering and her permission for him to leave, had finally released him from whatever had bound him to that place for over 200 years. Dr. McAllister documented the incident carefully, interviewing all witnesses. "What we may be seeing," he speculated, "is that some spirits remain not because they're trapped, but because they're waiting for acknowledgement, for justice, for someone to simply say, 'Your pain matters, your story is heard, you can rest now.'" This interpretation gained support from subsequent events. A French delegation visited the castle in late 2023, specifically to honor the memory of the prisoners who had died there. They held a ceremony in the vaults, reading the names carved on the doors, acknowledging each man's suffering and sacrifice. In the months that followed, reports of paranormal activity in the vaults decreased significantly, though they did not cease entirely. But not all the castle's spirits sought release. The Headless Drummer continued his eternal march, appearing whenever danger threatened. Young Robbie McPhee's pipes still echoed beneath the Royal Mile, his music a reminder of innocence lost and courage displayed. And the Grey Lady walked her chambers still, a witness to injustice that could never be fully remedied. These spirits, it seemed, had chosen to remain, not out of suffering or entrapment, but out of purpose. They were guardians of memory, ensuring that what had happened within these walls would never be forgotten. As Edinburgh Castle approached the mid-2020s, it stood at a unique intersection of past and present, history and mystery. During the day, it was a thriving tourist attraction, educating visitors about Scottish history and offering spectacular views of the city. But in the quiet hours, in the shadows and corners, in the deep vaults and ancient chambers, it remained what it had always been, a place where the dead walked among the living, where the past refused to remain past. Emma MacLeod, now in her 25th year of working at the castle, reflected on her quarter-century among the ghosts. "People ask me if I'm afraid," she said to a journalist writing a feature on the castle. "But I'm not. These spirits, they're part of the place, same as the stones and the history. They have stories to tell, and it's a privilege to hear them, even if hearing means feeling cold spots or seeing shadows or experiencing things I can't explain." "Do you think they'll ever all move on?" the journalist asked. "Like Pier Aubert did?" Emma considered this carefully. Some might if they're given what they need: acknowledgement, justice, peace. But others, I think they've become part of the castle itself. The drummer, the piper, they're as much a part of Edinburgh Castle as the crown jewels or St. Margaret's Chapel. They're the soul of the place in a way, and maybe that's how it should be. On a cold December evening in 2024, as the year drew to a close, a group of castle employees gathered in the Great Hall for their annual Christmas party. It was a tradition that went back decades, a chance for the people who kept the castle running to relax, celebrate, and share stories from the past year. As the evening wore on and the whiskey flowed more freely, the conversation inevitably turned to ghosts. Everyone had a story. The cleaner who had heard French voices singing in the vaults, the security guard who had seen the Grey Lady in the royal palace, the historian who had documented temperature drops that defied natural explanation. Thomas Grant, the guard who had seen the Headless Drummer in 2008, was there. Now retired but still living in Edinburgh, he had been invited back for the party. He listened to the younger employees' stories with a knowing smile. "The thing about this place," he said when someone asked for his perspective, "is that it teaches you humility. We think we understand how the world works, what's real and what's not. But Edinburgh Castle reminds us that reality is bigger and stranger than our theories can account for. The ghosts aren't here to frighten us. They're here to remind us that we're part of a continuum, that every generation is connected to those who came before and those who will come after." "But why here?" a young tour guide asked. "Why is this place so haunted when others aren't?" "Because of what happened here," Thomas replied. "Centuries of intense human experience, fear, courage, suffering, hope, death, and life. All of it soaked into the stones. This rock," he stamped his foot on the floor. "This ancient volcanic rock that's been here for millions of years, it absorbed all of it. And now it gives it back, shows it to us, makes us witnesses to history in the most direct way possible." As midnight approached and the party began to wind down, Emma MacLeod stood at one of the Great Hall's windows, looking out over nighttime Edinburgh. The city spread below the castle, lights twinkling in the darkness, modern life continuing its relentless pace. But up here on Castle Rock, time moved differently. The past was always present, the dead walked among the living, and the stones remembered everything. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Dr. Mac Allister approaching, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "Thinking about ghosts?" he asked with a slight smile. "Always," Emma replied. "Hard not to working here." "I've been doing some calculations," Dr. Mac Allister said. "Based on the documented appearances and patterns, I estimate the Headless Drummer should appear again within the next 3 to 5 years. The cycles suggest we're due for another warning." "Warning of what?" "That's the question, isn't it? The drummer doesn't specify. He just warns that danger is coming. Whether it's war or disaster or economic collapse or something we can't even imagine yet, we won't know until it arrives." Emma shivered despite the warmth of the hall. "And we can't do anything to stop it." "I don't think that's the point," Dr. Mac Allister said thoughtfully. "The drummer doesn't appear to prevent disaster. He appears to prepare us for it, to remind us that we've survived before and can survive again. He's a symbol of continuity, of the castle's endurance through everything history has thrown at it." As they stood together looking out over Edinburgh, a sound drifted up from somewhere below, faint but unmistakable. The sound of bagpipes, playing a melancholy tune that seemed to rise from the very heart of Castle Rock. Both of them smiled. Young Robbie MacPhee, still marching through his eternal darkness, still playing his pipes, still trying to find his way home. After all these centuries, he had become as much a part of Edinburgh as the Royal Mile itself. "Merry Christmas, Robbie," Emma whispered. "May you find your way home someday." The pipes played on for a moment longer, then faded into silence. And so the year ended, as years had ended for centuries before, with Edinburgh Castle standing watch over the city, its ghosts walking their ancient paths, its stones holding their countless memories. The fortress that had witnessed so much history continued to make its own history, existing simultaneously in past and present, a place where the veil between worlds grew thin and the dead spoke to the living. Tourists would come tomorrow, as they did every day, to see the crown jewels and the Great Hall, to take photos and learn history. Most would leave thinking they had visited an old building, nothing more. But some, the sensitive ones, the open ones, the ones fate had chosen, would experience something more. They would see a drummer with no head hear pipes playing beneath their feet, feel the despair of prisoners long dead, glimpse a woman in gray searching for justice that would never come.